A lot of aspects go into a short horror film. The writing, the setting, the story, the cinematography. But nothing is more important than the protagonist. The protagonist drives the story, they induce empathy in the audience, and the ending revolves around the consequences of their mortality. Lights Out understands this better than most horror shorts, but the glitch comes short of having an effective protagonist. Perhaps I can explain this with a lesson on protagonists. In all stories, a protagonist has two aspects: their personality and their motivation. In a feature-length film, the writer has time to effectively explore both. A short horror film is only a few minutes long. To effectively spend that time, one aspect must be sacrificed: the personality. A short horror film protagonist has what's called a super objective. This is the motivation of the protagonist throughout the entire short. The super objective provides the protagonist with objectives. Objectives are in-the-moment missions that are driven by the super objective. Objectives lead to actions. Actions are what the protagonist does to complete the objectives. You can only have one super objective. You can have as many objectives as you like, and you can only have one action for each objective. Say your protagonist's super objective is to fall in love. Their objective would be to find a suitable mate. Their action would be meeting someone at a bar. Their new objective would be to seduce this specific person. The action would be flirting with them. In most cases of the horror genre, the super objective is survival. Unless you'd like to get creative with it, these specific kinds of shorts will always use survival as the protagonist's super objective. Let's take a look at how David F. Sandberg's Lights Out fits this model. The protagonist is being stalked by a demon that seeks to kill her. The demon's motivation conflicts with the protagonist's super objective, and we have a story. The protagonist discovers that the demon only appears in the darkness. Her objective is to keep the light on. Her action is to tape the light switch. The protagonist heads to bed. The hallway light has turned off. Her next objective is to hide from the demon. Her action is to put blankets over her head. The bedside lamp begins flickering. Her objective is to keep the lamp on. Her action is to put the cable firmly into the power board. The action fails since the demon turns the lamp off. Her objective fails and her super objective fails. Lights Out's effectiveness is thanks to its simplicity. The protagonist only has 3 objectives in this short. This makes the short more focused, easier to follow, easier to be invested in. Each objective is connected to the actions of the demon. When it appears, the protagonist tries to keep the light on. When it turns the light off, the protagonist hides. When it unplugs the lamp, the protagonist plugs it back in. While Lights Out is only 2 minutes and 42 seconds long, Carl Godfrey's The Glitch takes 8 minutes and 24 seconds to tell a very simple story. Simpler than Lights Out's story. This is because Lights Out uses its time to push the story forward through the protagonist's actions, while The Glitch uses its time to explore the personality of the protagonist. The Glitch's protagonist, Melanie, has a super objective that is unclear, as she spends most of the short making coffee and messaging her boyfriend. Her motivation for this is simply because this is what she usually does. This is boring. The actual horror plot takes a back seat to explain what Melanie's normal life is like. It's like when Birdemic decides to spend a lot of its time showing the protagonist driving. The super objective should be survival, so make that the focus of the plot. When someone knocks on Melanie's door, her actions don't react in a way that would drive the plot forward. The knock is inconsequential to the protagonist and the plot. An effective protagonist is someone who takes action but can't necessarily take control. Melanie's discovery of the entity is completely by coincidence. If she chose not to send that selfie to her boyfriend at that moment, the plot wouldn't happen. A simple solution to this is to give her motivation for sending the selfie. In a short horror film, motivation is the most important aspect in a protagonist. Her only reaction to this discovery is sending a text to her boyfriend, which takes 13 seconds. The text ultimately does nothing to advance the plot. A light begins flickering. Sound familiar? The protagonist in Lights Out's reaction is to fix the light. Melanie's reaction is to turn the light off. She has no motivation to do this and is lowering her chances of survival. Now with photo evidence of the entity, Melanie's action is to back into the couch. She can't see behind her, even though it's very easy for the entity to sneak up on her from there. With unclear motivation, Melanie brings her phone up and discovers she can only see the entity through her phone camera. The entity jumps towards the door and Melanie follows to escape. Melanie finally commits an action that would match with the super objective of survival, except this action is inconsequential. The entity has decided of all times to now kill her. It could have killed her when her phone was up, or when she was not looking, or hell, even when she was walking through the door. Melanie's location in the house does not matter in the grand scheme of her death. Her actions don't matter. Let's briefly talk about the entity. Your entity can break the laws of physics, most do. However, your rules must be consistent. The entity sometimes only shows up on Melanie's phone, sometimes it's actually there. This is written off thanks to being a glitch. This is lazy writing. The entity's glitch in and out of reality has no effect on the short narratively and only affects the visuals. In good short horror films, the story is a conversation between the protagonist and the entity, communicating through actions. The entity performs an action, the protagonist reacts with an action corresponding to the one preceding it. As I've already explained, Lights Out succeeds at this while the glitch fails. Let's compare the actions of the protagonist and the entity in each short to better visualize the effectiveness of the short's respective protagonists. In Lights Out, the demon shows itself in the dark. The protagonist tapes the light switch. The demon turns the light off anyway. The protagonist hides under the sheets. The demon unplugs the lamp. The protagonist plugs it back in. In the glitch, the entity knocks on the door. Melanie does nothing. The entity shows up in a photo. Melanie backs into the couch. The entity runs to the door. Melanie runs to the door. Keep in mind the super objective, survival. The actions of the protagonist in Lights Out matches the super objective, while Melanie's actions in the glitch simply do not. When writing your protagonist for your short horror film, the best place to start is to write a story. If your story makes sense, you have a good protagonist. All you have to keep in mind is to have your protagonist's actions drive the plot and the entity's actions drive the protagonist's actions. And with all of that down, you have a great protagonist. Lights Out makes writing protagonists look easy, and that's because it is. What usually happens with poor protagonists is simply that the writer gets distracted, or feels the need to explore more than just a super objective. Simply put, complexity is a short horror film protagonist's worst enemy. Too much time is dedicated to something that is ultimately inconsequential to the endgame of the story. The glitch can be blamed for some bad writing, but its greatest sin is giving its protagonist too much depth. The glitch is redeemed by the opportunity it's given me to teach such an important lesson on short horror film writing. I hope you found this lesson informative. Class dismissed. Even when she was walking into the door. She was walking in the door. I haven't written that right. Even when she was walking in the door. Even when she was walking through the door.